Hello again. Last time we talked about the processes of language acquisition and learning to write and read, those three processes. Today I'd like to have us consider some examples of deaf students writing and how students have applied that to learning. We have a little bit of research in that area that I think is useful to know. We'll talk about how writing was viewed, and still is, in the research literature related to product, finished piece, and then how it has been looked at as a process. And I want to consider the research that's been connected to the use of some writing strategies. And then finally, consider what some professional writers say about the process. Okay? Let's talk about the product first. Traditionally, deaf students' writing has been viewed or has been analyzed for language, grammar, and vocabulary. Analyzed, they found that the vocabulary is restricted and there are a variety of grammatical errors. That's not surprising, that's what has been done. But also, the more recent research has found similarities between deaf and hearing second language learners. And also found really a positive effect of a strong first language background, in this case ASL, that with a strong background, form and content are better. Some of the researchers in describing the finished product writing have said, well, they've estimated deaf students are really behind. One estimate gave us like 7 years behind their hearing peers. And this led some researchers to wonder if maybe we were overlooking something. So one study, a team focused on more creative or narrative writing. And they took a group of hearing and deaf middle schoolers, gave them the assignment to write a story about finding a new civilization deep in the center of the earth. What did they do? They created some really interesting stories, as you can imagine. And when the team analyzed what we call the story grammar, or the structure of those stories, there was very little, minimal difference between the hearing and the deaf. They all wrote well-constructed, fluent stories. There were still, of course, surface grammatical errors, but this result led the researchers to wonder if maybe that had been true in many situations where these surface errors kind of masked the underlying structure. And many readers couldn't get beyond that to see the structure. They also, people have looked at, myself included, examples of personal writing. To see if maybe grammar or expression would be better in that kind of writing. What I'd like to show you now is an example of writing that I've taken from a dialogue journal. This was a group of a group of students in a vocabulary class. This was a developmental English class where the focus was on learning terms that related to personal emotion. I required two kinds of writing, kind of weekly compositions and also a dialogue journal where I told the students we would practice the new vocabulary and relate it to our personal experiences. So this is myself writing to JD, the student in the class. This is the first entry. Okay, then response. Okay, then my response. And JD accepted my suggestion and used part of that in a composition later. Let's go back to some of the research. The question was raised while people were trying informal writing and examining it. If the informal situation, the process writing approach would help improve vocabulary grammar. Of course, that was a question that would come up. And one large study that was done with over about 2 years with a large number of students, different schools, with dialogue journals and other kinds of writing, found that over time, they could demonstrate a significant improvement in vocabulary and grammar and fluency of writing. So there, with a large group, a variety of kinds of writing, but the focus was on personal, informal, they could demonstrate some improvement. That's one study. There have not been a lot of large-scale studies like that. Question was technology, would that help? Answer was yes. With use of computers, tended to encourage students to write more, so longer essays, wrote better organized essays, and generally more coherent. Another question that came up was, what happens at the point of composing, thinking about writing and writing, actual writing? Are students composing in ASL or English? We have different results. Several studies. One was an observational study of junior high school. Students wrote, these were skill assigners, all students, and the observation was that they were mouthing English while they were writing. And when questioned, they said, of course, I'm thinking in English. Students have reported hearing their voice while they're writing in English. But, as some of us have found, older college level students report that they do think in ASL. So we have tried test adaptation, for one example, another experiments with writing and composing in sign first. And students have said that that was more comfortable, more natural. So we have different results. They may depend on the individual backgrounds. And what about informal science writing? This has been more in the with hearing students than with deaf up to now. But one study collected samples from middle school and high school science teachers of deaf students. And I'll show you an example of that. Oops. Oh, this is time for an experiment. The first example relates to a science experiment that the teacher demonstrated and involved the students in. And I have to get my prop. Be right back. Okay, class. Okay. We have 2 bottles of Coke, right? One's diet, the other's regular. Okay, and I'm going to put these bottles in a tub of water. It's clear so you can see through the wall. I want you to tell me what you think will happen. One's regular, one's diet. I'll put them both in the water. What will happen to the bottles? Any guesses?
They'll float.
They'll float, okay, on the, or a little bit in the water. Another guess? No?
Stay.
They'll stay where?
On the can. Wherever they're sitting.
Well, we're going to put them in the water. We're going to put them in the water. They won't float.
You'll say they'll sink.
They'll sink.
They'll sink.
Okay, so we have different predictions here. Okay. Let's do it and see what happens. Okay? I'm not going to do it because I don't have the water. Let me show you what one observer in the class wrote. Deaf. What happened? Well, first of all, notice the writing. The students have been asked to predict. The teacher does the experiment. They're asked then to write down their observations, what happened, and then finally, what's the conclusion? And this was pretty accurate, what happened. The real Coke sank, and the diet kind of floated. Why? Sugar. There's like 3 tablespoons in real Coke, or more. And it makes the liquid more dense. Okay. So this was a kind of a science prediction experiment. We have creativity activities also that can be used in science classes. This was a biology class or life sciences, and students were asked to describe the digestive process in a creative story. So this is one example. I think the teacher was satisfied with the results. There were some details that maybe needed correcting, that was worked on later. And there were some different observations that became subjects of discussion in the class when they were finished.
John, I have a question. So were the 2 examples at the same level of students?
These were, yes.
Middle school?
The question was, were all the students middle school? Yes. It's about the same.
And the same level of language?
No, the varieties.
Okay.
A great variety
Okay.
of language level. I think this, you can see, is much more sophisticated, yeah. And it was from a variety of different schools. A third technique that has been examined also is now being encouraged for writing across the disciplines is this double entry notebook. And the process here is, generally, there are different ways to approach it, but you ask a student to read a difficult text and copy one portion of it exactly in their notebook. Then on the facing page, you ask the student to respond to that piece. And this was I think it was a junior high school now, students who were studying genetics in biology. And it was a story about Mendel. So this is, and I've cut the text. This was the original, part of the original. This is the student's response. The student continues, but also, and I think this was from the teacher's prompting, the students added questions they had about the text. So thoughtful questions, real questions, not teacher-produced questions. So this was seen by the teachers as a way of really engaging the students in the reading. And interestingly, if you remember, we talked about the different reading processes. Let me go back. What I think is happening here is that we're encouraging the student to do this really top-down approach to reading, or this objectifying reading. We're asking the student to step back and reflect on the reading. Let's consider some professional writers and their opinions about what strikes you about that?
Two things. One
Two
is
things?
that, writing assists in discovery of information. And secondly, that stories or creativity really help in making those difficult analytical connections, like cause and effect and interpretation of material.
Okay.
I would add to that, that the metaphor of the writing, the ways of seeing connections is very important here.
Like looking back on a train and seeing the cars connected that you didn't maybe relate to experience you didn't predict, you didn't remember or know.
Or seeing experience as an outline.
Experience as an outline. Okay, thanks. And we have wanted to show you two writers who are also professors at Stanford.
John, excuse me, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Do you ever show this to your own students? And how do they respond to it? Does it motivate them? Does it inspire them? Or does it go over their heads? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Question was, do I ever show this to my students, and then what happens? Does it inspire them, or are they puzzled by it, right? I had forgotten about this quote, this particular quote, so I haven't used it recently. I think, let's see, definitely with my students now, I think it would be interesting, even for very technical students. They would, I think, get the point that writing about a topic really focuses you on the topic and maybe helps you find things that you didn't know about. I'm seeing that in the writing drafts now, that really students are figuring out that by writing a rough draft, they understand what they don't understand about the article that they're using or something, and then go back. I haven't used this, and I think that's a good idea, though. I would like to. Because certainly it's a very clear expression of it. Maybe I would use the next one, too. Interesting that he compares it to telling a story, right? I thought that was kind of cool. And he's talking about professional journal writing, which is still, he maintains, is a story involving the reader. And maybe shocking the reader if you can. If I told that to my students, that you need to shock me, I don't know what would happen. And one more. I really like this because it, I think, explains really concisely the loop between thinking and writing, that they support each other, and that they're not disconnected. You think and then you put it down on paper. No, it's not that way. Rosemary?
I think that's such an important message to send, because most of my students continue to think of writing as product and as an evaluative piece of work, rather than for themselves a time to learn.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, that I sort of find myself right now rewarding uncertainty. So that writing doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up knowing. That sometimes it's a way of just expressing what you're trying to figure out.
So doubt. And leaving doubt is okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. The raising the right question may be really important.
Or it's a complex issue, and they have a complex approach to it. So if it's a simplistic one, it's easier to get to certainty. And if your approach is more complex, it's tougher.
Yeah, okay, good point. Yeah. Yeah. I need to think about that more, because I have been sort of rewarding a nice, neat conclusion.
Well,
Okay.
I'm saying it because it just recently, I was grading papers, and I have one excellent writer, and he couldn't figure out what he thought, because it was a very complex approach to the topic, and he kept kind of going back and forth in beautiful writing.
Wow.
And really bringing up very good questions, but still at the end, not quite sure. Which in an argumentative paper is really quite important, as opposed to a more simplistic approach that is certain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, those are great points. And I kind of picked these three quotes because I thought it matched with the research that we've found. Now, understand it's a limited amount still, and mostly with younger students than you will be talking about this week. But the professionals kind of compare well, I think, with the uses of process writing, in that the professionals say, I use writing to reflect, I use writing to help me observe, to help me discover things, and of course to record important information. No, again, I just think it supports our approach in using process writing with all ages of technical or other fields of sciences. Yes?
John, is there any research relative to transference of the skills that are demonstrated in sort of narrative personal writing? I know that in composition studies, that issue of transference is sort of constantly debated, and I was just curious if there was any research relative to deaf students.
It's an excellent question. Most of the research that I'm aware of has been reports from teachers. And so I don't have the original or haven't seen original documentation where you can see the transfer. But reports from the teachers say that this has led to improvements in lab reports, for example. That I think in that biology class, I'm sorry, the first one, but the Koch experiment, the teacher wanted to lead them to a more formal report, not a college-level lab report, but a formal summary, and felt that, yes, there was a transfer. Once they had the content, it was much easier to translate that into the form and add the appropriate language. So it's that kind of report that I've seen. But I think there's a need for more of that, more of really showing and documenting over time that there is an effect. I mean, it's difficult to document, but we need to try that.
But John, this point really reminds me of the 10-year rule.
Right.
You know, that the more students are writing and the more comfortable they feel, especially if it's writing that is not for evaluative purposes, that would lead to a more